My wife froze all my bank accounts overnight, every single one. She didn't leave a note, didn't send a text, didn't have the decency to look me in the eye when she did it. She just reached into the life we had built together and turned off the lights, leaving me standing in the dark. What she didn't know, and in what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was that I had been quietly, patiently holding a key that would unlock everything she thought she owned. If you've ever had the ground disappear beneath your feet, you know that specific kind of silence that follows, not the peaceful kind, the kind that rings. That was the morning I stood at the ATM outside the corner pharmacy, punching in my PIN for the third time, watching the machine spit back the same words. Account access restricted. Around me, the world moved the way it always does. Buses rolling past, pigeons arguing over a torn sandwich wrapper, a woman in a yellow coat walking a dog that looked like it owned the sidewalk. None of them noticed a man quietly falling apart in the grey morning light. Before we go any further, if you find yourself nodding along to this story, if something in it touches a nerve or lights a fire in you, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we tell the full story here, every time, no shortcuts. Now, where are you watching from today? Are you in New York, London, Lagos, Toronto, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your city in the comments. I genuinely want to know who's out there. My name is Daniel Marsh, and for 11 years, I believed that love was enough to hold two people together. I was wrong about that, but I was right about something far more important, and the proof of it would arrive in a manila envelope on the worst morning of my life. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning, the quiet one. The one that looks ordinary from the outside but is already rotting underneath. I met Claudia Voss at a fundraising dinner for a children's hospital in the autumn of what felt like the last good year. She was standing near the bar with a champagne flute she hadn't touched, wearing a burgundy dress that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent, which at the time was saying something. She was beautiful in the particular way that some people are beautiful. All surface and symmetry, a face designed to make you stop thinking clearly. I stopped thinking clearly for approximately 11 years. Claudia came from what her family called old money, which meant money that had been around long enough to develop a personality. Her mother, Eloise Voss, was a woman carved from the same marble as a courthouse statue, cold, imposing, and utterly convinced that the world owed her reverence. Eloise had spent Claudia's entire childhood cataloguing other people's social ranks the way some people catalogue stamps, and she had passed that particular hobby on to her daughter like an heirloom. Her brother Marcus was worse in the way that supporting characters in a bad play are always worse than the lead. Broader, louder, less subtle. Marcus ran a small private equity firm that he described at every possible dinner party as boutique, which was the financial world's word for small and not as successful as advertised. He drove a car that cost more than most people's homes, wore watches that he made sure to mention were limited edition, and possessed the specific arrogance of a man who has never once been told that he is tedious. I was not from old money. I was not from any kind of money. I was the son of a retired school teacher from a mid-sized city in Ohio, a man named Gerald Marsh, who worked Saturdays at a hardware store for 20 years to make sure I could go to college without debt. My father died when I was 32, quietly, in the night, in the bed where he had slept for 40 years. I was at his side. Claudia was at a spa weekend with her mother. She sent flowers to the funeral, expensive ones. She stood at the graveside in oversized sunglasses and black cashmere and squeezed my arm at the appropriate moments. And her mother stood 3 steps back as though grief were contagious and whispered something to Marcus that made him press his lips together to suppress a smile. I saw it. I said nothing. That was a pattern I would repeat for years. seeing, saying nothing, filing it away in some interior drawer that I kept meaning to empty and never did. The inciting humiliation, and there is always one, always a moment you can point to later and say, that was where it truly began, happened not at the funeral, but 2 weeks after. We had all gathered at the Voss family home for what Eloise called a restorative dinner, which was her phrase for a dinner where she sat at the head of the table and decided things. Eloise had decided something that evening. She had decided, apparently, none that my father's death was a financially inconvenient event for the Voss family because it had interrupted a property negotiation that Claudia and I had been loosely involved in. A small investment property I had saved for over 8 years to put a down payment on. It was nothing glamorous. A 3-unit apartment building in a neighborhood that was just beginning to recover from hard times. But it was mine, or it was supposed to be. "We've been discussing the property," Eloise said over the soup course, not looking at me, addressing Claudia as though I weren't present. "Given Daniel's current situation, it makes more sense for the deed to be structured through the family trust." I set down my spoon. "My current situation?" Eloise looked at me then, and her expression was the look you give a child who has interrupted adult conversation. "Oh, your financial situation, Daniel. You'll be taking on funeral costs, travel. These things add up. It simply makes more sense." Marcus reached for the bread basket. "Practically speaking, you'd still benefit. The asset would remain in the family." I looked at Claudia. She was looking at her soup. Her jaw was set in that particular way that meant she had already agreed to something without telling me. 3 weeks later, the deed to the apartment building was transferred into the Voss family trust. I signed the papers after a conversation with Claudia that I cannot fully reconstruct because my memory of it has been replaced by a kind of white noise. The sound a mind makes when it is protecting itself from something it should have walked away from. That was year 3 of our marriage. There were 8 more to come. And the years that followed were a slow erosion. Not dramatic, not violent, the kind of erosion that happens to coastlines. Imperceptible on a Tuesday, catastrophic over a decade. Claudia's spending increased as my standing in the household decreased. She discovered a social circle of women whose primary occupation was the performance of luxury, and she flung herself into it with the devotion of a convert. Weekend trips to places I wasn't invited to. Dinners with people I had never met. A renovation of the kitchen that cost more than my father's entire house. I worked. That was what I did. I was a structural engineer, mid-level management at a firm that handled commercial construction projects, and I was good at my job the way workhorses are good at their jobs, steadily, without applause. My salary was substantial. It went into a joint account, and from that joint account, money was spent on things I had no part in choosing. I didn't stop loving Claudia. That's the part that's hardest to explain. Love doesn't have an off switch, particularly when you are the kind of person who was raised to believe that commitment is something you honor, even when it costs you. My father had taught me that. Gerald Marsh, who worked Saturdays at a hardware store and never once complained about the life he had. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Not the letter that matters most. That would come later. This letter was from my father's estate attorney, a man named Hartwell who had offices in a small building 2 blocks from the hardware store where my father had worked. The letter indicated that there remained one outstanding item from Gerald Marsh's estate that had not yet been transferred, a parcel of land in a rural county several hours from the city, which my father had purchased in the 1980s and never developed, never sold, and never discussed with anyone, as far as I knew. The letter sat on my desk at the office for 4 days while I tried to find a moment of mental stillness in which to deal with it. It was a Wednesday evening, late, when I finally picked it up and read it a second time. There was a handwritten note clipped to the back that I had missed the first time. A note in my father's careful, precise handwriting that said only, "Daniel, I kept this for you. I always thought you would know what to do with it. Go see Hartwell. Trust him." Something shifted in my chest when I read that. Something that had been very still for a very long time. I didn't mention the letter to Claudia. I'm not sure I can fully explain why. Call it instinct. Call it the accumulated weight of years of watching things I cared about disappear into the Voss family trust. I simply folded the letter back into its envelope, put it in the breast pocket of my jacket, and made an appointment to see Hartwell the following Friday. Meanwhile, Claudia had been spending more time with Marcus. That alone wouldn't have alarmed me. They were siblings. But there was a quality to the time, a texture that felt different. Hushed conversations that ended when I walked into rooms. A new password on her phone that she changed without mentioning it. A dinner reservation for 2 at a restaurant I recognized as the kind of place people went when they were celebrating something they hadn't told you about yet. I began to pay closer attention. It was Marcus's assistant, a young man named Perry, who had worked for Marcus for 3 years and had never received a raise, a fact he mentioned to me at a family Christmas party, with the careful casualness of someone who wants you to understand something without quite saying it, who first let something slip. Perry was standing near the drinks table when Marcus walked past with his arm around a woman I had never seen before, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh with her whole throat. "She's been around a lot lately," Perry said to no one in particular, and then caught himself and looked at me and looked at the floor and went to get more ice. I recognized her. She was one of Claudia's social circle. A woman named Serena who wore her hair in a severe blonde chignon, and whose laugh I now recalled I had heard through the door of Claudia's study on more than one late evening when I had thought Claudia was on a work call. I went home. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I thought about my father and the parcel of land and the note in his careful handwriting. The Friday appointment with Hartwell fell on the same week that everything else began to accelerate. Hartwell's office was as I had imagined it from my childhood. The memory of waiting outside while my father consulted with someone important, sitting on a bench with a book. Dark wood panelling, a framed photograph of Hartwell shaking hands with someone official. Files stacked with a precision that suggested decades of professional discipline. Hartwell himself was a man in his late 60s with the kind of face that has been resolving complicated situations for so long that it has settled permanently into a posture of composed authority. He stood when I entered and shook my hand with both of his. "Your father spoke of you often," he said. He was very clear about his intentions. I sat down. "The land," I said. "Tell me about the land." What Hartwell told me over the next hour rearranged every piece of furniture in my interior life. The parcel was not a parcel in the sense I had assumed. A few rural acres, perhaps with a farmhouse, perhaps agricultural. The kind of land a working-class man from Ohio might buy in the 80s as a quiet investment and forget about. It was, in fact, a 147-acre tract of land that sat on what had turned out to be, over the following 4 decades, an extraordinarily valuable intersection of geography. A major regional highway project, approved by the state legislature 18 months ago, which was several months before my father died, had designated a significant portion of land in that county for acquisition and development. Multiple independent appraisals, commissioned by 3 separate development companies that had been approaching Hartwell's office for over a year, placed the fair market value of my father's parcel at between $68 and $74 million. I sat very still. Outside Hartwell's window, A pigeon landed on the ledge and looked in with professional indifference. "He never told you," Hartwell said. It wasn't a question. "He never told anyone," I said. "He was concerned," Hartwell said carefully, "about outside influences affecting decisions regarding the land. He was explicit in his instructions. The land transfers to you and you alone, held in a separate legal structure, entirely apart from any joint marital assets. It is not subject to community property claims. He consulted with a property attorney, a tax specialist, and myself over a period of years to ensure this." I looked at the stack of documents Hartwell had placed in front of me. Clean, precise, airtight. The work of a man who had spent years making quiet plans while working Saturdays at a hardware store and never once complaining about the life he had. "There's something else," Hartwell said. He slid a second folder across the desk. Inside was a report from a forensic accounting firm that Hartwell had retained on my behalf, apparently on my father's instruction and at my father's pre-arranged expense, covering the financial activities related to the apartment building I had signed over to the Voss Family Trust 8 years ago. I had signed over, as it turned out, a building that now sat on land that had been quietly and systematically rezoned over the intervening years through a series of municipal contacts that the report carefully documented. The building itself had been sold, without my knowledge or consent, to using a legal maneuver that the report characterized as ethically questionable and potentially fraudulently executed given the original transfer terms, to a development group that was partially owned through a shell corporation by Marcus Voss. The profit from that sale, $4,200,000. My signature on the original transfer document had been used to facilitate a transaction I had never approved, for a property I had saved 8 years to buy for a profit I had never seen. The pigeon on the ledge outside had not moved. It regarded me with its amber eyes. I understood, for the first time in a long time, exactly what I was looking at. I drove back to the city. I did not go home. I went to the parking garage adjacent to my office building and sat in my car for 45 minutes doing something I hadn't done since I was a child, which was cry with my whole body. The kind of crying that feels like it is emptying something out rather than releasing it. I cried for my father. I cried for 8 years of erosion. I cried for the man who had stood at an ATM in the morning light watching his accounts lock shut around him. Because by the time I reached that parking garage, I had already checked my phone and discovered that the account freeze had happened. 3 accounts, joint and individual, frozen overnight. She hadn't waited. Whatever she and Marcus had been planning, the timeline had moved up. I wiped my face. I straightened my jacket. I called Hartwell. "I need to move quickly," I said. "Oh, I expected you might," he said. "I've taken the liberty of identifying a colleague, a litigation specialist. Her name is Adaeze Okonkwo. She handles asset protection and fraud recovery. She's been briefed on the basics. Can you meet with her tomorrow morning?" "Yes," I said. "Daniel." A pause. "Your father was a very wise man." "I know," I said. Adaeze Okonkwo occupied an office on the 14th floor of a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that certain kinds of power prefer not to advertise themselves. She was a compact, precise woman in her mid-40s, whose stillness, when she listened, was the kind that made you understand she was processing everything at a level several floors below conversation. She listened to the full account without interrupting. When I finished, and she picked up her pen and wrote something on the legal pad in front of her, then looked up. "The account freeze," she said. "Your wife's name is on all 3 accounts?" "Joint accounts, yes. One was supposed to be individual. A savings account I opened before the marriage. Apparently she was added to it during the refinancing of our mortgage 4 years ago. I didn't notice. She was counting on that. a Daisy said, without emotion. The freeze is intended to make you desperate and compliant. Without access to funds, the calculation is that you'll agree to whatever divorce terms she presents in order to regain financial stability. What she doesn't know, I said, is the land. Adais allowed herself a single quiet smile. What she doesn't know is the land, because it was never a marital asset. It was never disclosed in any joint filing. It exists entirely outside the structure of your marriage. And the fraud? The building? That, she said, picking up her pen again, is a separate and very interesting matter. The forensic report is solid. The Shell Corporation trail is documented. Marcus Voss used your signature on a document with a scope that did not authorize the subsequent sale. That is fraud. It is potentially criminal fraud, and it is certainly actionable civil fraud. She tapped the pen on the pad. How would you like to proceed? I had thought about that in the car on the way over. I had thought about my father at his kitchen table with his careful handwriting. I had thought about the Voss family Christmas party and Marcus's arm around Serena while Perry studied the floor. I had thought about Claudia's soup bowl and her jaw set in that way that meant she had already decided. I want it to be complete, I said. I want it to be thorough, and I want it to be legal. All three are achievable, Adais said. The plan unfolded over the following 10 days with the kind of methodical precision that my father would have recognized and respected. Adais filed for the dissolution of the marriage on my behalf, simultaneously submitting a full asset disclosure that included the land parcel and its valuation. The filing also contained a formal counterclaim regarding the apartment building transaction, attaching the forensic accounting report in full. A separate packet, assembled with the care and attention to detail of someone who had spent decades building airtight structures, was delivered to the State Financial Regulatory Authority, the County District Attorney's Office, and the Bar Association's Oversight Committee, the last of which was relevant because it emerged from Adais's investigation that the attorney who had facilitated the apartment building transfer had a professional relationship with Marcus Voss that had not been disclosed to me at the time of signing. Adais also filed an emergency motion to unfreeze my individual accounts, supported by documentation demonstrating that the savings account had been improperly co-titled, and that the freeze had been executed as part of a pattern of financial control that the court would need to examine. The first domino fell on a Tuesday. Marcus Voss received a formal notice from the district attorney's office informing him that his financial activities related to the sale of the apartment building were under criminal investigation. The notice arrived at his office at 9 in the morning. By 11, his firm's 3 institutional clients, the ones that gave the word boutique any meaning at all, had each received a compliance inquiry from their own regulatory bodies asking about the nature of their relationship with Marcus Voss Equity Partners. By 2 in the afternoon, 2 of the 3 had suspended their agreements pending review. Perry, who had called me quietly that morning to tell me the notice had arrived and that Marcus had not come out of his office since, said that he could hear things being slammed against walls. But I was at a coffee shop 4 blocks from my old office, eating a sandwich, reading a book about river engineering. I thanked Perry and went back to my sandwich. Claudia called that evening, 7 times. I did not answer. She arrived at the apartment I had taken on a short-term lease. Adais had recommended I vacate the family home during proceedings, which I had done 3 days prior, and knocked on the door with the particular rhythm of someone who has always had doors opened for them before they finish knocking. I didn't open it. She left a voicemail that was equal parts threat and pleading, which is a combination that tells you everything about a person. The threat was that her attorney would make the divorce process extremely painful for me. The pleading was that we could still work this out, that she had made mistakes, but that she still loved me, that I should call her back. I forwarded the voicemail to Adais and went to sleep. The second domino was quieter but heavier. The Bar Association's inquiry into the attorney who had handled the apartment building transfer resulted within 6 days in the temporary suspension of his license pending investigation. The attorney, a man named Clifford, who had been practicing for 30 years and whose framed certificates I had studied while waiting to sign documents I did not fully understand, retained his own counsel and, in doing so, provided a full account of his instructions. Those instructions had come from Marcus Voss. The account, once provided under the pressure of professional self-preservation, was detailed, specific, and devastating. When Marcus Voss was arrested on a Friday morning outside his apartment building, the charge was fraud. The arrest was not quiet. There were neighbors watching from windows. There was a photographer from a local business publication who happened, or didn't happen, to be nearby. The image that circulated showed Marcus in the grey suit he had been wearing when they approached him, his face caught between disbelief and a fury that had no useful target. Eloise Voss called Claudia within minutes of the arrest. Their conversation, according to documents obtained through the legal process that I will not detail here because the specifics are beside the point, lasted 47 minutes and covered, among other topics, how best to insulate the Voss family trust from what Eloise called Daniel's aggression. What Eloise had not yet understood, what neither of them had processed in the chaos of the preceding days, was that the Voss family trust was not what she thought it was. In the course of the forensic investigation, it emerged that the trust had been used as a vehicle for a series of transactions over the years that, on examination, were not as cleanly structured as Eloise had believed. 3 separate transfers of assets into the trust, including, critically, the apartment building that had been sold through Marcus's Shell Corporation, had been conducted in ways that created legal liability for the trust itself. The trust's assets were now subject to a civil claim as proceeds of a fraudulent transaction. But the trust that Eloise had spent 30 years building as an impenetrable fortress around the Voss family's wealth was, as Adaise explained to me over the phone with the calm of someone reporting the weather, now the subject of a freezing order. Every account, every asset, every investment. I thought about Eloise at the graveside with her 3 steps of distance and the whisper to Marcus and the suppressed smile. I thought about the soup course and the bread basket and the phrase, practically speaking. I thought about my father at his kitchen table. The final confrontation was not in a courtroom, although the courtroom would come later. It was in the conference room of Adaise's firm on a Wednesday afternoon, with grey autumn light coming through the tall windows and the city going about its business 14 stories below. Aunt Claudia sat across the table from me for the first time in 3 weeks, flanked by 2 attorneys. She looked the way expensive things look when they have been left in the rain, still recognizably themselves, but altered in some fundamental way. Eloise had insisted on being present. She sat at the far end of the table in a black suit that was either a coincidence or a statement. Her face was as composed as ever, but her hands, folded on the table, were pressing against each other with a force that whitened her knuckles. Adaise opened the session with a summary of the legal position. It took 12 minutes. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Claudia's senior attorney spoke first, something careful and procedural about the terms of the dissolution and the question of joint assets. And Adaise let him finish and then placed a document in the center of the table. "The land," she said. I watched Claudia's face when she heard the number. $71 million, sole title, non-marital asset, not subject to division. It moved across her expression the way a weather system moves across open water, slowly at first, then all at once. "That's not possible," Claudia said. Her voice was different from the voicemail, stripped of its architecture. It is not only possible, Adaz said, it has been confirmed by 3 independent appraisals and is fully documented in the disclosure we filed with the court. Your husband, your soon-to-be former husband, is the sole legal owner of a land asset worth approximately $71 million, upheld in a trust structure that predates your marriage and is entirely insulated from marital property claims. Eloise unfolded her hands. She placed them flat on the table. This is a fabrication, she said. Gerald Marsh was a hardware store employee. I had not planned to speak, but I found that I had something to say. My father, I said, was a school teacher who worked Saturdays at a hardware store so that I could go to college without debt. He was also a man who spent 20 years making quiet plans for his son's future, while people like you looked at him and saw nothing worth looking at. Eloise opened her mouth. He saw you, I said. He saw all of you. He saw what this family was and what it would do, and he made sure that when it did those things there would be nothing left for you to take. The room was quiet again. You spent 11 years treating me like a financial inconvenience, I said to Claudia. You signed my name to documents I never approved. You froze my accounts to force me into compliance. You built your entire plan around the assumption that I had nothing and was nothing. What you didn't know, because what my father made sure you would never know until it was too late, was that I was holding more than all of you put together. Claudia was crying, not the elegant kind of crying that is compatible with composure. The other kind. Eloise was not crying. Eloise was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a woman recalculating everything. The civil fraud claim against the estate of Marcus Voss, the Voss family trust, or can the attorney of record will proceed regardless of the outcome of the dissolution, Adaz said, in the tone of someone tidying away the last items on a list. The criminal proceedings against Marcus Voss are a separate matter entirely. We have nothing further to present at this session. She closed her folder. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I looked at Claudia one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the particular kind of exhausted clarity that comes at the end of a very long and unnecessary journey. I hope, I said, that whatever you were planning with Serena was worth it. I walked out. The dissolution was finalized 4 months later. The terms reflected the reality of the legal position, which was that Claudia had no claim to the land, that the joint accounts were divided equitably, and that the marital home, which had been purchased primarily with my income, was sold and the proceeds split according to a formula that Adaz negotiated without emotion and without compromise. Marcus Voss was convicted of fraud 18 months after his arrest. He received a sentence of 4 years and was ordered to pay restitution of $4,200,000, the full profit from the apartment building sale, plus damages. The Shell Corporation was dissolved, the boutique firm closed, the limited edition watches were sold as part of an asset liquidation. The Voss family trust was not dissolved entirely, but after the civil claim was settled, its value was reduced to approximately a third of what it had been. Eloise retained a lawyer to contest the settlement. She lost. She moved to a smaller home in a less prominent neighborhood and did not, as far as I am aware, resume hosting restorative dinners. Clifford, the attorney who had processed the transfer, lost his license permanently. He did not contest it. I sold the land to the Development Consortium for $72,300,000 on a Tuesday in March in Hartwell's office, with a pot of coffee that had been sitting too long and a view of the building where the hardware store used to be before it became a coffee shop. I sat for a while after the signing in the chair across from Hartwell's desk, looking at nothing in particular. "What will you do with it?" Hartwell asked, not because it was his business, but because he had known my father for a long time and was entitled to be curious. "Some of it," I said, "is going to a scholarship fund for engineering students, kids who are paying their own way." I looked at the window. "The rest I'll figure out. I'm not in a hurry." Hartwell nodded. He seemed satisfied with that. I was not in a hurry. That was true. I had learned, slowly, at cost, in the way that real lessons always arrive, that patience is not the same as passivity, that enduring is not the same as accepting, that a man can work Saturdays at a hardware store for 20 years and quietly, carefully build something that outlasts every person who ever looked at him and saw nothing worth looking at. 6 months after the dissolution was finalized, I met a woman named Ruth at a conference on sustainable infrastructure, where she was presenting research on flood-resilient urban planning, and I was in the audience genuinely interested in what she had to say. She was direct and unpretentious, and laughed at things that were actually funny, and when she disagreed with something, she said so plainly and without drama. We had dinner. Then we had more dinners. She knew what I had been through in the broad strokes because it had not been entirely private, and she did not treat it as a spectacle or a wound. She treated it as a thing that had happened to a person she was getting to know. That was new. It was a good kind of new. I live in a modest apartment now, modest by the measure of what I could afford, which means it is comfortable and well lit and has a view of a park where I run in the mornings before work. I still work. Engineering is not something I wanted to retire from. It is the practice of making things that hold, and I find that meaningful in a way that has nothing to do with salary. The scholarship fund has sent 11 students to engineering programs in its first 2 years. One of them, a young man from a mid-sized city in Ohio who worked weekends at a grocery store to make his tuition, wrote me a letter in the second semester that I folded and put in my breast pocket and have not taken out since because it is doing its work perfectly well in there. What Claudia and Eloise and Marcus never understood, what the people who measure worth in watches and wine lists and the size of family trusts never understand, is that the real inheritance my father left me had nothing to do with the land. The land was the instrument, and the inheritance was the lesson that a quiet man who does his work and keeps his word and plans carefully and loves his son is building something that no amount of arrogance or cruelty or condescension can reach. They saw a hardware store employee. They saw a structural engineer from Ohio with no family money and no social standing and no visible claim to their attention or respect. They saw a man they could use and discard. They saw wrong. True power is not what you display at a dinner table or announce at a Christmas party. It is not the watch on your wrist or the car in your garage or the trust in your family's name. It is what you build quietly over years, while the people who think they own the world are too busy congratulating themselves to notice you working. My father knew that. He left me everything I needed to know it too. And that, more than the land, more than the money, more than the fraud conviction and the dissolved trust and the closed firm and the lost license, is what I carry with me every morning when I lace up my shoes and go out to run in the light of a day that belongs entirely to me. What would you have done in my position? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of something true about the kind of patience that isn't weakness, hit that like button one more time. It helps more people find stories like this one. I'll see you in the next video.